Thank you for coming back for part 2. Just quickly, is there anybody new who has joined us who wasn't here last session? Okay, so we have a handful of people. What we've sort of covered so far is a lot of context in terms of what capacity for care means, why we want to stay within our capacity for care, and what some of the key determinants of that are. So really with the goal of being able to help as many animals as possible, ensuring that we can provide for their physical and behavioral well-being while they're in our care, and doing that in a way that is humane for them, humane for our staff and volunteers, and does not stretch us beyond the means with which we can do that. So what we're going to spend the rest of the session talking about is really a bit of the so what. Okay, great, that makes sense. So what? What do I do with that? Or how do I do that? Because these are really tricky things sometimes. It's great to have a conceptual understanding of something to say, yes, I get that, I understand why it's important, but what do I do with that in my organization? We have this roadblock, how do we make that happen? So what do we do that? How do we overcome those obstacles? And I'm going to provide some suggestions and some ideas. And I think one of the things that's so nice about conferences like this is also the opportunity for dialogue and to kind of crowdsource ideas that have worked for other organizations. Because there may be something brilliant that somebody else has tried and worked wonderfully for them. And the reality is not everything is going to work for every organization, right? Some of the things that I say to you, you may think are brilliant and will work great for you, and other things you may think, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard of, we tried that and that didn't work for us. Because you need to figure out a plan that works for your specific set of circumstance. There's not a cookbook that we can give you to go by. But what we really want to try to do, we talked about that kind of negative cycle that we can get into when we're operating beyond our capacity for care, and we have crowding and all of those negative effects on the animals and on the people, and then what that means for our organization. What we really want to do with the practices that we're going to talk about in this session is get us into that positive cycle where we can improve animal care, we have healthier, happier animals, we have more adoptions, we have reduced sheltering costs, we have more resources for prevention, we have fewer animals that need sheltering, so we can improve animal care, and so on and so forth. Because this is the circle that you really want to be in, right? Not the other circle. We want the high-fiving dog and cat. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example in terms of the numbers, because one of the things that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about is how to actually come up with those numbers for your organization to understand what your population is going to be with some, sort of level of reasonable prediction based on historic trends, and what that means for staffing. And these are not overly complex math calculations. They are addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. So something definitely that your iPhone can handle. But I think that actually walking through them is very helpful for people. So we'll spend a little bit of time doing that. And I'm going to use some data from one shelter as an example. And I just pulled out cats from this, in part to highlight one of the reasons that we do this on a monthly basis. Because here in the Northeast especially, where many of our organizations deal with a majority of cats and kittens, there's real seasonality to what our lives look like, right? What your shelter looks like today probably looks a fair bit different than what it does on January 28th, right? Or January 20, today's 29th, 6 months from now. Because we see a lot of seasonal variation, and that has to do in large part, and we won't go into it, but with the biology of cats and how they reproduce and the timing of the year. So this is just feline data from a shelter in the Northeast, and this is looking at their data month over month. So again, on the bottom we have January through December, and the number going up the side is the total number of incoming cats and kittens for that organization. So the kittens are shown here in the dark reddish purple, and the cats you can see down here. So what really stands out on this to you? Right, so Mountain Kitten So we have this big, big peak, and then we sort of have this high plateau, and it starts going back down. That correlates with the vast majority of kitten births that we see that then come into the shelter. The other thing, this is not an unusual blip, but I like the way it just shows up in here. It looks like cat ears to me. I did not do that artificially. That really was what their numbers looked like. But you can see for adult cats, it's pretty continuous throughout the year. We do, in some shelters, tend to see a little bit more of a blip in kitten season, which is probably here's mom with kittens, or here's pregnant mom with about to be kittens. But we don't see that really dramatic mount kitten effect with the adult cats. But what this means in terms of planning is huge, right? And this is a very graphic illustration of something that you guys know intrinsically from the work that you do. If you tried to plan year-round, if you said, here's how many enclosures we think we need, how many foster homes, how much staff, how much cat food and cat litter we have to buy, based on what we see in January, how's that going to work for you this time of year? Yeah, not so much. So we really want to get an accurate picture so that you can plan both across the year as you plan for an entire year, but with some precision when you see variation. So for this shelter, between April and October, half of the year, more than 70% of the cats that they take in for the entire year come in. So really, really concentrated. So when we think about what that means in terms of enclosures, that means that that's the maximum capacity that your shelter either needs to be built for, or you need to have a very strong network of places for those cats to go that does not require them to be in the facility. So maybe you have a number of enclosures that supports a number of cats maybe about here, and everybody over there is going to need to go into a foster home or somewhere else other than your organization, but you want to be able to plan for that. So this was a shelter that had live release rates a lot lower than we would like to see. So under 30% for adult cats. Kittens fared a little bit better. Again, not necessarily uncommon for a lot of organizations because we know how attractive kittens are to the adopting public. But even still, only about half of the kittens. And their euthanasia roughly paralleled their intake. So the top line on here, the dark one, is intake, just again going month over month. This line right here is euthanasia, which you can see follows it almost exactly. And then here are their adoption numbers. And they were, a little bit up and down, but pretty much flat all year long, or not a lot of variation all year long. And certainly much lower than their euthanasia rate. So when we think about starting to plan, one of the first things that you want to do, if you haven't done it already, is figure out how many animals do you expect to see. And to do that in an objective way, looking at your intake data, instead of the feeling of, it seems like there's 100 animals that come in every single day. Maybe there really are 100 animals that come in every single day to your organization, but our anecdotal feelings don't always match up with reality, right? I know, you can name all different sorts of examples. You take a test, and the only questions that you remember are the ones that you didn't know the answers to. Or you feel like one time we had a really bad experience doing this in the shelter, and now we're afraid to ever do this again because we tend to weight different experiences differently. So you really want to do it off of the numbers and not just a sort of subjective assessment. How many of you have strong intake numbers that you could pull back from a year or two or more to actually take a look at? Okay, so even if you don't, there's no time to start like the present. You can certainly collect that and start with your best subjective evaluation and then start accruing that data so that you have it in the future. How many of you have actually gone and looked on a monthly basis or on a annual basis in terms of what that means and use those numbers for planning? Okay, so a number of you, good. So first things first, starting with how many you expect to see. So you want to do this in a couple of different ways. Really, you want to look back over a couple of years for your intake data if you have it, because we do sometimes see a little bit of variation from year to year. And many communities also have a trend. Sometimes that trend is increasing intake. If you're in a community where the population is rapidly expanding, sometimes intake will be going up. Many communities, thankfully, we're seeing a decrease in intake, a general trend to decrease. So it's nice to have a few years to look at. You're going to want to separate out strays from owner surrenders if you take in both. And the reason why, when we start talking about calculating holding capacities, is because they have different requirements for how long you have to hold on to them, right? So you're going to have a legally required stray hold for some or all of your animals, depending on what state you're in. You're not going to have that. You may have a policy hold, but you're not going to typically have, unless you are somewhere with a very specific local regulation, you're not going to have a legal requirement for owner surrenders. And then if you have any other significant source of intake that makes up like a good chunk of your intake and has a different holding period, you would want to think about that as well. So last session I showed you a slide that had the bars and then had the lines going across it. And I said that shelter did law enforcement, and they also did the rabies observations for the local Department of Health. Those were significant numbers and different holds, so they calculated all of those individually. And then you want to separate by species and by age. And after looking at mountain kitten, I don't think I need to tell you why that is. But definitely puppies and kittens from adult dogs and cats, if you have the data to do it. And if you do have the data to do it, we often will use an age of 5 months as sort of a cutoff, and that has to do with some things like when we feel like they can be reliably protected against certain infectious diseases with vaccination. A lot of people have 6 months as a threshold, and for this activity, I think that's fine. And if you can't do it, we can manage without it, but ideally you would, and then you want to check month over month. So here's an example. Again, this is just looking at cats month over month for a shelter. You can see the line on the top is stray cats, stray kittens, surrendered cats, and surrendered kittens. So this is their feline intake. They didn't have other significant sources of intake broken out for a whole year. And I did round these slightly just because math with decimal points gets more complicating to show. That is the reality that you will have, but I get to cheat and make them rounder numbers. So the first thing that you want to figure out is what your monthly daily average is for the animals coming in. And so you take the number of animals in whatever category that is that you're looking at that are coming into the shelter each month, and you divide it by the number of days in the month. Just divide it by 30. Don't make yourself crazy about what month has 21 or 29 or 31 or 28 or 30 will give you a good enough idea. And then if you do it, if you're familiar with Excel or some of the other spreadsheets, you can also just enter the formulas and it saves you from doing the math. So I just do 30 for the sake of convenience. But you want to do that month over month. So if we take this example, we'll pull May out from here, and let's do it for stray intake. So we have 107 cats coming in May. I made it more complicated. I forgot I did that. So I would now round that down to 30 for the sake of convenience. But May has 31 days, so we divide by 31. That comes out to 3.5. And when I do these for holding capacity, I always round up from planning purposes, because what do you do with half a cat? You don't really get half a cat. Okay, so pretty straightforward math. So if we did that over month over month over month, you can see I just filled in what these were for strays. So it's all of their monthly data divided by 30, and that gives you the number of how many on average are coming in every day, which is helpful in and of itself, right? We talked about that example earlier. If you estimate a certain amount of time that you need for intake processing, for their initial exam and their vaccinations, if you know how many are coming in every day, you can use that to estimate how much staff time you need to provide that critical point of service. You can also use this to estimate how much housing you are going to need to meet your requirement to hold them for stray period, in this case, as the example. So this is just to meet that legal requirement if that applies to you. So you're going to take your monthly daily average, which we just figured out for that category, and then you're going to multiply it by the legal holding period. And you can do this for all of your other types of intake if you want to come up with what the total amount of space that you need just to bring them in and meet that initial requirement is. So we had 3.5 there that we calculated out for this shelter in May. And if we multiply that, this shelter was not in New York State. This was a shelter in Maryland, actually. Their holding requirement was 7 days. So their stray holding capacity is 25. 25 stray cats at any given time in the building just to meet that legal holding requirement. So before I go any further, let me stop. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is one piece of their number, right? That's their stray holding capacity. And we still want to think about what we would need to hold owner surrender cats as they come in. We still want to think about how many we might have in different stages of the process in the shelter and how many we want to have in adoption. But this can be really helpful in terms of just thinking about the bare minimum. If all you did was hold these cats for stray period and then they left the shelter immediately, how many would you have in the building at any given time? So for this shelter, going back to Mount Kitten here, they calculated out their minimum holding capacity, and it ranged from somewhere between 25 to 55 cats a month, depending on the time of year, right? So that's that huge variation. And the difference between needing to find space for 25 cats and 55 cats can be pretty significant. That's not necessarily enclosures. When you think about kittens, most of your kittens, many of your kittens are probably coming in as litters, so you may have 3 or 4 on average to an enclosure. So it's not necessarily an absolute number of enclosures, but it is the number of cats. And that's a really important number, not just because of caging, but also because of staffing, like we talked about earlier. So previously in their holding area, they had a holding area just for cats as they came in. They were housing about 150 cats in September, just in their holding area. And that was in part for 2 reasons. One, they had a 14-day quarantine period because of concerns of panleukopenia. We very, very, very rarely, if ever, recommend quarantine as a routine matter of course for cats coming into shelters. For the main reason that it is often counterproductive in terms of what it does to your population and their overall risk of disease and exposure. But the other reason was that even after that 14-day quarantine period, they were slipping through the cracks. Cats weren't being identified that they were eligible to be moved out of that room, and so they were staying in there an extra day or 2 or 3, and sometimes it was because somebody didn't notice that they were ready to move up. Sometimes it was because there wasn't space to move them up. There was a variety of reasons, but obviously they had a huge, huge number sitting back there and holding. Yes?
So you don't recommend a quarantine period at all?
We generally, so let me speak for myself. Let me not paint everybody in broad brush strokes. I generally do not recommend a quarantine period, particularly for cats coming into shelters. If you have certain populations that have a very high risk of disease or a very specific concern, if you have an ongoing disease outbreak in your facility that you are trying to keep incoming separate from an existing population, if there's something definitive that we are trying to address, then sometimes we will utilize quarantine. But doing it as a matter of course for cats who are coming in, because it increases their length of stay, that often dramatically increases their risk of developing an upper respiratory infection. It really swells your shelter population, which often creates capacity for care and housing issues. I do not routinely recommend that. All the hands go up. Yes? Yeah, so it's a good question. The question was, doesn't that depend a little bit on your intake protocol and what you're doing? And the short answer is yes. So this is one of the things that I think is probably really frustrating for shelters is when you ask a veterinarian a question, there is rarely a yes without a but or a no without a but that follows and then a whole bunch of caveats. And the reality is it is very situation dependent. So if you, for example, had a facility that was primarily long-term sanctuary, and you had all of your cats in group housing, they were long-term residents, we might think about doing a quarantine before new incoming cats were introduced to that population. It depends a little bit on what diseases you're talking about that are a concern. Is that something that could be identified through testing? Is that something that is feasible to do a quarantine? So I'll give you a non-cat example. If you said we really wanted to do a quarantine for dogs coming into the shelter because we were worried about them coming in with distemper, and you wanted to do it through holding them for a quarantine period to see if they got sick, you're looking at a 4 to 6 week quarantine period. So that's not really a realistic thing that we're going to look at for doing for most organizations or for pretty much any organization. So it really depends on the for what and the why in the particular circumstance. Was there another question about that? Yes. Yeah, so the comment was with most of the cats coming in through a TNR program and with a seasonal frequency of seeing panleukopenia, if that would be indicated. And without diverting too much time to it, and we can certainly chat after, I will give that a really strong maybe. So it really depends. It really, when we think about things like quarantine period, it comes down to thinking about what that would achieve in the best circumstance and what are the costs of doing that, and really trying to decide if that makes sense. And sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. So looking at those numbers, knowing that now, they can plan for 20 to 25 adult cats throughout the year. And then because most of their change, right, so adult cats are pretty flat. Most of their change that you see in that 25 to 55 range is coming from the kittens. Then they're looking at up to 20 to 30 kittens during the summer months. And I didn't show you all of the breakdown, but we had actually done their numbers for adult cats and for kittens, and so we could really see that without just looking qualitatively at a graph. Here's another thing that can be really helpful about doing out what your minimum holding capacity is and comparing that to staffing requirements and then what you are actually housing in that area of the shelter. So this is canine for one shelter. This is, so it's in table instead of graph format. So months going down, January on top, December on the bottom. And you can see for this shelter, they did stray, owner surrender, and what the total was. So this was their required holding capacity. This was just for, and I will explain why they have owner surrendered on here. This was just for what they considered the minimum amount of time that they would have to hang on to the animal. So stray was based on the legal stray hold in that jurisdiction. Owner surrender was based off of a functional policy that no animal would ever, except in very rare circumstance, would ever end up functionally leaving the shelter the same day, because by the time it was taken in, even if it was turned around and made available for adoption, it was realistically probably still staying the 1 day in the shelter. So they had just assigned a number of 1 for themselves to plan, and then you can see the total. So not as much variation often in dog populations that we see in cat populations, because we don't usually see that big increase in puppies, and many of us don't see very many puppies here in the Northeast anymore unless we're actively transporting them in. But you can see a little bit of variation. They range from a low of 33. They had a high of 47 here in July, which, speaking to them, was a little bit of a fluke. In terms of intake, there was some stuff going on in the town that they thought contributed to that. But usually somewhere in the mid-30s to the low 40s. And so you can estimate what the staffing requirement is to provide the basic care. So taking that 15 minutes that we talked about earlier as the estimate for just feeding and cleaning. If that's the total dog population that they're going to have to maintain at a minimum, here's how many hours they're going to need to care for them and how many people are going to be required to do that. So don't get too hung up on what the specific numbers are, but what I want to show you is the comparison to what their actual population was that they were handling, that they were housing in these holding areas. And you can see these are all a factor of about 50%, 40% higher than what the requirement was. And again, a lot of this was lack of efficiency. So this was animals who were now hanging back because they had a microchip identified and there was a delay in calling the owner or sending out the letter, or an animal who really should have been moved up and he fell through the cracks and somebody didn't realize that he was eligible, or somebody who is hanging back because in this shelter they weren't eligible to move out of holding until they'd had a behavior evaluation. They couldn't do behavior evaluations 3 days a week because of staffing, so they had animals hanging back. So there's a variety of reasons, and what those reasons are always specific to an organization, although there's often some common threads. But you can see functionally what they actually, the number of dogs that they had back there was about 40% higher than if they were moving them as efficiently as possible. And so that in turn is going to increase the number of staff that are required to provide care for them. So if you look, the absolute numbers are not astronomically different. So you're talking about the difference between 39 dogs in January and 53 that they actually had there, or the difference between 40 dogs in November and the 55 that they actually had back there. But that alone translates to the need for one extra full-time equivalent person or volunteer just to care for what feels like a fairly small increase in the population that's back there. And so understanding what the holding capacity would be if you did everything as optimally, efficiently as you possibly could, and where you are in terms of who is actually back there can be helpful to give you an idea of how much scope there is to tighten that up and to help decrease length of stay. Does that make sense? Okay. Yes?
With the staffing, the 9.7 hours in January, that's to care for them as outlined in 4 hours.
So that is 15 minutes per animal with them getting that done in 4 hours. And again, if you had a design where it really took you a lot longer than 15 minutes, that number would change accordingly. But yes, that's what those estimates are based off of. You're welcome. Good question. And the other thing that I've probably said indirectly, but I just want to underscore, that is just cleaning and feeding. So that is not socialization, that is not enrichment, that is not grooming, medical exam, that's nothing else. So all of those other things still need to be accounted for and still need staff time. This is really just are they in a reasonably clean cage, and do they have food to eat level of care? Okay, so you can do that for all of the different types of intakes that you have, the different species, to get an idea for how many animals in the different areas of your facility you essentially have to have if you don't change intake. So if you don't do something to reduce the number of animals that are coming in, through safety net programs, through managed intake, through some combination, that's how many will be there. But we have animals that stay with us for longer, right? Either by choice, or I wouldn't say it's choice that we end up having them stay with us for a lot longer, but by necessity. So this is not at all to say, figure out what all of your required capacity is, and that's how many animals you should have in the building. Because that doesn't give you any time for them, right? If they need to be rehabilitated because of medical or behavioral issues, if they need to have more than 30 seconds on the adoption floor to have somebody say, yes, I want to take you home with me. So please don't take that to be that is the number that you should have in your facility. But it is helpful to determine what your absolute minimum staffing levels are. In terms of how many animals we have on the adoption floor, this is another area where doing some math can be helpful. So this is very common, that many shelters decide how many animals should be available for adoption on your adoption floor. Just by looking at the amount of cage space that you have, and then you move everybody up as quickly as they become available into that open cage. So I won't put anybody on the spot and ask if that is how you make decisions about how many animals should be up in adoption or how they get there. I will tell you that I have certainly worked for organizations that have done it that way. But there's some challenges with that, right? Because we know not every animal who goes up to adoption is the same in the eyes of adopters, is the same in terms of their needs within the facility, or is going to stay there for the same amount of time, right? There's some variation there. So let's go back and take cats as an example. So this was a shelter that had made the decision about how many cats to put up, basically as a function of how many cages were available. And they were relatively small enclosures, a little bit of a hodgepodge in terms of the sizes and where they had been acquired from, and a lot of cats available for adoption, with the idea of you deserve a chance to be seen by somebody who might want to take you home. Let's get you up there. But one of the things that you'll often hear talked about, or that you may hear talked about, is adoption-driven capacity. And this is a more objective way to try to determine how many animals you make available for adoption. So certainly there's that overarching consideration of capacity for care. Do you have an appropriate enclosure? Do you have the staff and the volunteers to meet that animal's physical and behavioral needs? Do you have the other resources to support them? You want to make sure that whatever number you put up for adoption fits within that constraint. But if that answer is 150 cats, do you want to put 150 cats up for adoption on your adoption floor? Do you? Probably not. Maybe. There's another solid maybe for you. But probably not. And one of the things that can be really helpful in coming up with an answer to that is to look at adoption-driven capacity, because this will help you minimize overcrowding. It helps reduce the average length of stay for the cats on the adoption floor, and again, improving the quality of care for the animals while they're in your shelter. And I know this is now being used with cats as an example. This is not cat specific. This applies to dogs. It would apply to rabbits or any other species that you might work with. So this was that same adoption area redone after looking at adoption-driven capacity and making some decisions to change flow and to change process for how animals were moved up to the adoption floor. And certainly this is not only much nicer for the cats in terms of the enclosures and the care that they're getting, it's a lot easier for the staff. This makes the staff more efficient when you're not trying to clean in little tiny enclosures where you're taking the cats out or trying to work around them. And it's much nicer for the adopters. So lots of pieces that fall into this. But the idea here with adoption-driven capacity is that you're going to look at the number of adoptions that you do for dogs and cats and puppies and kittens, just like we broke down intake. This time you're going to do it for adoptions. And you're going to decide on a goal for length of stay in adoption. This is average length of stay. This isn't a time stamp with an expiration date of, once you hit 10 days, you can't be on the adoption floor anymore and you have to leave. But it's an average and it's a goal to give an idea of the number of animals that you would want to have on the adoption floor at any given time. So you're going to take a look at your historic adoption data. Hopefully you have that. And the goal that you established for your average length of stay. So who's probably going to move faster? Right, so these four will probably go in the same time. Even if you said I have 2 enclosures and I can move kitten 1 up, he gets adopted. I move kitten 2 up, he gets adopted. I move kitten 3 up, he gets adopted. Oh, the big fat black and white cat just got adopted, and now kitten 4 gets adopted. So these guys are not the same in terms of how quickly they're going to move. And this is a little bit of an obvious example. Sometimes I think we have a good sense of who are likely to be harder to place animals, and sometimes it's kind of surprising. You look and you're like, why are you still here? I don't understand why nobody has picked you. But it's trying to balance having variety, having a mixture of animals who may take a little bit longer and who can move a little bit quicker when we come up with that average. So if you said you want an average of 2 weeks on the adoption floor, not everybody's going to stay exactly 2 weeks, right? This guy maybe is going to take 3 months to move. So he needs to be balanced out with some other cats or kittens who are going to move that much more quickly so that that space stays dynamic and we don't end up getting full of cats who maybe take longer to adopt. So again, if you have fluffy orange kittens, I am particularly partial to orange kittens, or maybe you have an older, slightly grumpy, maybe he's FIV positive, needs some dental work, we'll throw a bunch of issues, realistic issues in there with him. So he's still a great candidate, and that is not at all to say don't make him available for adoption, don't promote him. I'm completely not saying that at all, but we need to think realistically about what it's going to take to support him and his needs and how that's going to balance out in terms of people coming in to adopt. So we want to have a variety, right? If we had an adoption floor that was predominantly older cats with more issues, medical issues, behavioral challenges, maybe this guy's got a history of inappropriate elimination, and this one is a tortie, so I don't have to say anything else about her. Actually, the nicest cat that I've ever had in my entire life was a tortie, but I don't think she knew what she looked like. These guys may take a bit longer, and then we have somebody over here who's going to go super quick. So you're going to have a longer average length of stay on the adoption floor if this is who's up there in all likelihood. So this really goes to a concept of not overstocking. And I know that many of us hate that terminology that sounds like we are referring to animals as merchandise, and I completely get that, and I am not suggesting that at all, but in many ways we are displaying animals for consumers to come in and decide that they want to adopt. And so a lot of these concepts apply to adoption. So we want to have a nice variety, but we don't want it to be so overwhelming for people. We want to have animals in better conditions. It's easier for the staff and volunteers to focus on them. They can get adopted more quickly. And then because the space opens up more quickly, you can move them up that much faster. So this goes back to the efficiency through reducing length of stay than if you were having tons of them and they were sitting there for longer. So if you can figure out for your organization, maybe it's a couple of key factors that you know. This is high demand. These are animals that fly out the door. So for many of us, that's puppies, for example. Puppies, anything, dogs under 15 pounds, kittens in December, whatever it is that you know. Those are the animals that we want to slate to get them through as quickly as possible, get them up to adoption, even if that means jumping the line of somebody who had been there longer, because we know that they're going to leave that much more quickly, and then we can focus those resources instead of caring for them maybe back in an area where they're not available for adoption. We can get them out, get them on their pathway to a permanent home, and then focus on somebody else. How many of you have heard the less is more jam concept? Okay, so a number of you. And this really goes back, it is not the, cats are not jam, nor are dogs jam, but the idea really goes back to consumer behavior and when it becomes overwhelming to make choice. And you think about like when you go shopping and you have to pick something out, if you go in and there's like 17 aisles of jam and they're stacked in the, floor and they're falling off the shelves and you can't find somebody to help you and some of them are dusty. That's a very different experience and may even dissuade you from making a decision than if you have a reasonable selection that seems well maintained and fresh and rotated. So the idea is that it really does help us to move the cats more efficiently, provide, and dogs as well, provide good customer service. And we can do a lot of things to help keep that length of stay down to drive those outcomes. We heard lots of ideas when we started last session about promotions. So whether that's over a certain age, fee waived, different promotions based on holidays, whatever that is, special events, adopt-a-thons, making use of off-site events, utilizing volunteers through foster networks to have them help find adoptable homes for the animals so that they don't have to come back to your facility to be adopted. Again, so that we can reduce that length of stay and help as many as possible.
What if you don't keep your animals separate?
Yeah, so the question was, what if you don't keep your animals separate? And sometimes another variation of this is even if you do keep your animals separate, if you do open selection where the public can come and they can see animals that are still on hold, you may not do a separate calculation for this, but thinking about in terms of where those animals are going to go in those spaces, if you have some really slow track cats or slow track animals that you know are going to take longer to move, maybe those are animals that are prioritized to go through foster and they're marketed separately. In the busy summer months, for example, sometimes having fewer cats because they unfortunately often get passed over for the kittens, having other avenues for them, focusing on them through offsite events, through foster to adopt programs, other ways like that. So it doesn't always become a functional number that you want to calculate or really strongly adhere to, but it can help provide some guidance when you think about how animals are being identified and housed in the facility. So this is just the calculation in terms of adoption-driven capacity, if that was a number you wanted to do. The other thing that you can do, so this looks kind of like that first graph that I showed you that was shelter intake and length of stay. This is the number of adoptions per month, how many cats are housed in adoption, and what their average length of stay in adoption is. So it's really like the same variation on the graph that we showed earlier. But you can figure out, if you do have separate areas, if you want a target length of stay. So let's say I want an average of 14 days and I have 50 adoptions a month. So 14 days is blue, 50 adoptions a month corresponds out here to about 22 cats. And I look at that number and I say, well, 22 cats doesn't work for me. That's not enough for whatever reason. I want more cats available for adoption. Well, that tells you that you need to increase your number of adoptions per month. So you can look at doing promotions. Maybe you change the fee structure, do fee waived if you aren't already. Find some offsite locations, do some special events. It can help you strategize about what do you want to change if the current scenario is not what you would like to have. So for this shelter, the one that I was showing you the examples for, they had much higher adoption rates for kittens than adults. The majority of their adoptions were kittens, and you can see over the course of a year, almost by a 2-to-1 ratio. But if you walked onto their adoption floor, most of the cats available were adult cats. And so what happened was kittens would come through very quickly, adult cats would sit there, and that actually ended up creating a situation where I said, some of them were hanging out because they were in holding on quarantine, some of them were hanging out because they fell through the cracks, but a lot of them were hanging out because there was nowhere for them to go. And that's just showing that for that shelter. So what they also saw was that the adult cats stayed way longer than the kittens did. And even though it sometimes feels unfair to say, little kitten, you get to jump the line to go up for adoption over the cat who's been there longer, it actually ends up helping everybody. It helps those two individual animals and the whole population because we can move them more quickly. And who doesn't want more time or money, right? So you don't want to have to sell the dog because of all your bills, but we really want to make this as efficient as possible so that we're ensuring welfare and helping as many animals as possible. So what does this look like putting this into action? So one of the big things is making timely decisions. How many of you would say that for the most part when an animal comes in, sometimes you're wrong, but for the most part when an animal comes in, you feel like you have a pretty good idea of what their likely outcome is? Yeah, usually, we can look and we can say, oh, you're going to go really fast, or you're maybe going to take a little bit longer. You look like you have some medical issues. You have a collar and tag, so we need to try to find your owner to get you back home. We usually have a fairly good sense, based on that initial intake information and the first exam and time that we spend with that animal, a general idea of where they're likely to go. And so pathway planning really is taking that first information, deciding on a likely outcome for that animal. That's not a fixed outcome. That doesn't mean they can't change their pathway, but that's really thinking about what's likely for this animal, where are we trying to get them, and what needs to happen that they can get there as quickly as possible. So pathway planning itself and then daily rounds are two big pieces of this. So what your pathways are going to depend a little bit on your organization. Return to owner, return to field programs, if you transfer to rescue or to other shelters. Foster is not an outcome in and of itself, but I'll leave it up here for the purposes of this discussion. Adoption or euthanasia. Some of those may not be relevant to your particular organization, but you want to think about the various outcomes that animals in your care might have, and then think about what does it take to get them to that outcome so that we can get them there as quickly as possible. And if we need to change their pathway, that we can do that and get them onto the right pathway as quickly as possible. So if we're thinking about a return to owner or a reclaim, we want to make sure that we're checking up front as soon as they come in for visual identification, that we're scanning for a microchip. There are a few things that I find more frustrating when a microchip is found when an animal goes up for spay-neuter because they're going to the adoption floor after they've been in the shelter for several days because it was missed on intake. You think about what that means in terms of the amount of time that they spent, the welfare considerations, the resource considerations, and mistakes happen, and maybe the batteries were low or whatever the reason was, but we really want to think about what we can do to get them there as quickly as possible. Lost and found reports, posting photographs on the internet. If you have other shelters in the community that accept lost and found reports or anything like that, making sure that you're trying to stay in the loop with those as well. If you are likely to send animals to foster, prioritizing getting them out quickly. Know who your foster volunteers are and what the shelter constraints are in terms of who's eligible to go to foster, what type of resources can you provide. And you really want to plan who's out in foster right now. Obviously, you want to know where they are. And you also want to plan for when they're coming back. Because what happens if you send all of your kittens out in the beginning of kitten season without a plan for when they're coming back? And then people start showing up in August and they're like, hey, here you go. That is just shifting the problem slightly. So great that they're now of age, but we really want to plan for when they're coming back and stage that accordingly. This was a very, very old foster dog that I had. His lip is like bent up on the bone. He was the saddest old dog ever, and he was the cutest thing. But this is the idea behind Foster on Deck program. So you have fosters identified, you know who they can take, you know who is ready to take another animal, and they know that the next time a litter of bottle babies comes in, for example, or whatever that criteria is, we're going to call you, come get the animal today, so that you can move them out as quickly as possible. And also thinking about how we can leverage, I was having a conversation on the break with somebody about how do we manage when we say, okay, we know our capacity for care is here, our population is here, how do we bring those into alignment? And that is hard. One of the things in terms of thinking about how to do that and thinking about how stopping to take in animals factors into that is looking at what other resources can we provide instead of bringing the animals into the shelter. So can we recruit the volunteers? Can we recruit volunteers from the people in the community who are saying, I found a litter of kittens, can we equip them to be foster volunteers, to do foster to surrender, or to do foster to adopt programs on the other end to transition the animals out of the shelter more quickly? This is a super complicated algorithm that one shelter did, or I had done as an example for a shelter rather, in terms of figuring out who went to foster and how they were prioritized in terms of going to foster. So what's the need? Is it because of space in the shelter? Is it a medical issue? Are they too young for adoption? And then what were all of the questions that had to be answered to get them through that? If you're planning on transferring, if you have rescue or foster transfer, you want to build or sometimes rebuild those relationships. Identify who are candidates. Know who takes which animals, when they can take them, what the constraints are, so that there's open communication on both ends. And then as soon as you can, contact the organizations to arrange transfer. I know it's really easy sometimes to feel like, well, it's okay if the letter, for the microchip goes out tomorrow, or, it's almost the end of the day, so we'll call the rescue group tomorrow and see if they can come get them. But every day really does make a significant difference for that individual animal and for the population as a whole. So you really want to make the call today. In terms of adoption planning, this goes back to decision-making criteria, and it's not just for adoption, it's for all of your pathways. But one of the things that can be very helpful in determining pathways and how animals are going to get there is to identify what are the criteria that animals are eligible for adoption, that are eligible for transfer, that are eligible for foster. What are the criteria for euthanasia, both behaviorally and medically, so that that is in place and understood and can be acted upon quickly. And then we talked a little bit about fast tracking and slow tracking. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going a little quickly here. Even for euthanasia outcomes, if you do owner-requested euthanasia and you're taking those in from the public and it's a request that you feel is appropriate that you're going to honor, you want to make sure that that's done as quickly as possible. That really is the most humane thing for the animal. Okay, daily rounds. So I heard one person say daily rounds is a tool in the toolbox. How many of you guys are doing this? Yay! That makes me so happy. So we'll go through this fairly quickly. So the idea with daily rounds is that they are performed daily. And I know that that's kind of stating the obvious, but I really wanted to underscore that because it is also easy, I think, when you have a lot of other things going on to say, I don't have time to do rounds today. I'm just not going to do it. I can't get to it, I'll do it tomorrow. And that is where some of those cracks show up that can create bottlenecks and lengthen the amount of time that animals spend with us. So these are really population rounds, or the what can I do for you today rounds, that are looking at each animal in the building, what pathway we think they're on in terms of where they're going, what else do they need to get there? Are you on the pathway to go to adoption, but we need to get you spayed before you can be made eligible. We need to make sure that we get that surgery scheduled now so that you're not hanging back here waiting for that. And then figure out a way to make that happen. This can be really helpful not only in terms of helping to move those animals individually, but in terms of identifying where your bottlenecks are and where you maybe need to redistribute or identify additional resources. So let's take spay-neuter as an example again. If you do not have sufficient spay-neuter capacity and you have animals that are otherwise ready and can't leave, they can't go back to an owner, they can't go through a return to field program, they can't go up for adoption because they're waiting on spay-neuter, and that's adding extra days to the amount of time that they're there, that becomes a critical point that we need to figure out a way to address to increase that capacity. So doing rounds requires somebody who has the training, the knowledge, and the authority to identify these issues and then to act on them. And it requires a commitment by all of the staff and management to make it a priority. It also requires that you have, or at least start, accurate data collection and entry, and that you have a process to make it work. And sometimes having equipment is really helpful. So spending the money to buy a tablet or to buy a laptop so that you have that access. Spending the money to get the barcode scanner that you can do inventory if you're on Chameleon without having to manually enter it. A lot of times things that have an initial outlay for equipment, what they save us in terms of time more than pay for themselves in the long run, or even sometimes really in the short run. And then ideally you want somebody who acts as the rounds leader or the taskmaster and has a team behind them. So who your team is depends on your shelter. Maybe it is somebody from your veterinary staff, somebody from your behavior staff, the shelter manager, the foster coordinator. For some shelters, that is all one person, or that's two people. So for bigger organizations, there may be 5 or 6 people who are part of rounds. For smaller organizations, it may be one person. And that's okay, even if you have to start small without everybody who would be ideal to be in the rounds process, getting that going will still be really helpful. So having somebody as a taskmaster is really helpful. You know, it really should be somebody who's kind of like a border collie. They're really persistent, they're going to follow through, They're a little bit annoying, but they're not going to drop the ball on it. And they're going to make sure that whatever is identified that needs to get done is going to get done and happen. And it needs to be somebody who gets it, right? You know, so that's a really kind of like qualitative, hard to, you know, nail down quality, but it needs to be somebody who can think several steps ahead, who really understands all of the moving pieces in the shelter, and what's going to be necessary for planning an animal movement. And in some cases, for bigger organizations, actually creating a dedicated position that deals with population management and daily rounds can be very, very helpful. This is from several years ago, but this was the job description for Asheville Humane Society in North Carolina. They created a position of placement and population care manager. So again, the idea, this is the same cat from start to finish. Bodega in New York City in the basement with a broken leg and a bad URI and clearly filthy, and then several weeks later. So what he needs to get from here to here, whatever that individual animal needs, we want to make sure that we are keeping that as straight and short a line as possible, and that we're not ending up in bottlenecks, waiting on ineffective or delayed treatment, waiting on delays for spay-neuter or whatever those bottlenecks might be. As part of the rounds process, you always want to follow up on the previous decisions and identify delays. So is that waiting for medical services? Is that waiting for behavioral services? Waiting for transfer? Where are the inefficiencies that we can work on that just let us move the animals through more quickly? And they're not necessarily, when I say just let us move the animals through more quickly, they're not necessarily quick or easy fixes, right? If you say, well, all of our delays are associated in spay-neuter, and we really need another veterinarian on staff, I'm not suggesting that finding the funding for that is necessarily a quick or easy thing to address, but we want to identify where those are and start to work towards that, even if that's incrementally. That we can't do that right now, but maybe we can hire somebody 2 extra days a week to do surgeries on Friday and Saturday going into busy adoption weekends to start making incremental improvements. And then, like I said, following up on previous decisions to ensure accountability, reevaluating pathways as needed. So sometimes our first guess isn't right. There's a surprise or the animal's condition changes. And understanding and identifying that quickly so we can get them where they need to go is really important. I just put an example in of an action list or a tracking form to help facilitate rounds. And really, if you're not doing it already, this is, I think, one of the simplest things that you can start to do to really identify where your bottlenecks are, reduce length of stay, and to help move those animals through more quickly to ensure that we're providing them the care that we want to provide. And then I just wanted to finish with a couple of other ideas in terms of thinking about how else you might make time. Because what we really are talking about in many ways here is efficiency. So moving them through more quickly, but not by changing outcome, not by diminishing what we're providing, actually by increasing the quality of the care that we can provide, which in turn helps free up resources for other animals and lets us save more lives. So doing things like installing better housing that can keep the animals physically and behaviorally healthy, that makes it easier to clean and sanitize the cages. How many of you have cleaned a cat in a portalized cat cage? Would you rather do that or in a 2x2? It's much easier, right? It's much faster. You think about if you have guillotined enclosures for dogs, double compartment enclosures, whether it's cats or dogs. If you can put everybody on one side, you can do it without the stress, without the time that it takes to handle everybody, without the risk of fomite transmission. You can do that quickly, efficiently. You can move on to other activities. That is huge. And so when we think about how we're using housing and what we have to use housing, sure, there is a nominal expense associated with portals or with, depending on how you upgrade your housing, sometimes it's a significant expense. But you want to think about what that can save for animal care days, for staff time, for resources and for lives and well-being. Your cleaning protocols, thinking of, again, not just about the housing, but what are you cleaning with? How is it being applied? How is the staff assigned? What type of equipment do you use? What products are you using? Is it something that is a very labor-intensive process that has a very long contact time? Are you full cleaning every cage every day? Maybe you can implement spot cleaning within your existing structure. And again, thinking about the resources that takes, looking at balancing what might be an increased cost if you were to switch to, say, an accelerated hydrogen peroxide disinfectant that is often more dollars up front in terms of supply costs, but so much more efficient in terms of what it means for staffing. It almost always pays for itself. Because again, if we can move them through more efficiently, house them more humanely, and stay within our capacity for care, where would you rather visit or work? Or where would you rather live if you were an animal? So I'm going to stop there. I just want to put an acknowledgement in for some of the slides that were borrowed from other people. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.